African American Studies there. He's also the author of 9 books, including Race Matters and Keeping Faith, and they're all available outside from Afro Books. After the lecture, we're going to have a reception in Tilton Hall, and I also would like to thank Reverend Brown and Campus Ministry and WPI for making this event possible.
Marion, thank you so very much. Thank each and every one of you. I can't see too many of you, but each and every one of you for coming out this evening. I look forward to our discussion and our dialogue. Can each and every one of you hear me? Yes. That's very important. I am delighted to be here. I had a wonderful time at WPI this afternoon. As I mentioned to them, I had a very high and low experience yesterday. I spent most of the time at Maryland State Penitentiary. The high times, you can imagine, tremendous intelligence, creativity, and a sense of determination there, but also a low time because when I looked in the eyes of so many of those fellow human beings who are now prisoners, I said to myself, so much unrealized potentiality. Wasted energy. I could not but rededicate myself to the tradition that produced me. And I'm talking about the tradition that James Baldwin called Many Thousands Gone. I'm sure many of you recall that powerful essay in his collection entitled Notes of a Native Son. The many thousands gone are those who gave their time and their energy, and some their lives to the struggle for freedom. And I don't mention this just because this is February, the shortest month of the year, Black History Month. Every month is for me Black History Month. Because I decided a long time ago that I wanted to be a small part of this tradition. A certain sense of calling and vocation, trying to live a life to the best of one's ability that would hold up the highest standards, intellectual, moral, political, existential. Those like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells Barnett, E. Philip Randolph, and Marcus Garvey, Hannah Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Martin King, Malcolm X. One could go on and on. And of course, the nameless and anonymous ones. But the struggle for freedom, especially the struggle for black freedom, is in no way confined to people of African descent. We need to know more about Lydia Maria Child, who wrote that powerful text in September of 1833 entitled Appeal in Favor of that class of Americans called Africans. White sister gave her life for black freedom. Worked alongside John Brown, white brother, who gave his life for black freedom. Elijah Lovejoy shot standing on the roof of his house in 1837 in Albany, Illinois. Wendell Phillips or Charles Sumner. Miles Horton of Highlander Center. You all recall Miles Horton in Tennessee, training and being taught by Rosa Parks and Bob Moses and a Stokely Carmichael and a Diane Nash and a host of other freedom fighters. Miles Horton, white brother. Well, one thinks of Rabbi David Einhorn in Baltimore, who was run out of town and had his synagogue burned because of his identification with the abolitionist movement. Identification, struggle for black freedom. We're talking about actions. We're talking about deeds. We're talking about people who made sacrifice. Abraham Joshua Heschel, Beatrice Magda, similar so. Brown, brother like Jose Marta T. always included white supremacy, one of the objects of critique in his own struggle to liberate so many downtrodden yet dignified brothers and sisters in Latin America from imperial subjugation. One can go on and on. Grace Ball to Asian sisters. The movement itself is a movement in which one takes moral stands and tries to garner and muster intellectual weaponry to make a blow for freedom. It's true that it tends to target white supremacy and its various vicious assaults and attacks on black beauty, trying to convince black people that they have the wrong hips and lips and noses, skin pigmentation and hair texture. The white supremacist assaults on black intelligence, on black capacity and black capability, yes, on black humanity. You see, for me, the black freedom struggle is a species of what I call loosely the radical democratic tradition. By radical democratic tradition, I mean in part trying to take seriously the subversive notion that ordinary people ought to live lives of decency and dignity. And they're more likely to do so if their voices are heard at the highest levels of the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives. I believe that the radical democratic tradition is the best that we featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces have produced. Going back to the history of the human adventure, going back to the Sumerians of Mesopotamia or the Egyptians of northern Africa, this notion that ordinary people, lives have epic significance, that everyone has a distinctive kind of unusualness that makes each and every one of us unique and distinctive and singular and irreducible, and each have equal value. So many ways a subversive notion. Why? Because when we look at history of human adventure, for the most part, ordinary people have been usually associated with mob or mass or herd or rabble. Poisonous flies and weeds and raindrops and vermin and bacteria. Ordinary folk. There used to be a brother who played the organ in my church when I was growing up in Sacramento, California. We knew him as Sylvester, but he's known to the world for the genius that he is. His name was Sly Stone. He wrote a song called Everyday People. Arrested Development picked it up a few years ago and called it People Every Day. Same point. Same point. I am everyday people. What does it say? Ordinary people's lives is actually shot through with a sense of sublimity, sense of the tragic and problematic. How rare it's been. The greatest artists that we've known can actually apply their sophisticated skills to depicting the complexity and depth, the levels of elevation or humiliation of ordinary people. Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, grand and great as they were, they reserved the tragic for the elites, well-to-do. Same is true of Shakespeare himself. Elizabethan England. How rare it is. I'm sure that you recall those first two famous chapters of Eric Auerbach's classic Mimesis, published in 1946. He begins to talk about the contrast between Homer and the Old Testament, which in that old Hebrew Bible one actually locates tragic among an everyday Adam or an everyday refugee like Jacob, a chap who finds himself in pits like Joseph, or moving on even to the new, a homeless, nomadic, artisanal Palestinian Jew like Jesus, or in Islamic tradition, for Muhammad, unlettered, but having tremendous impact in terms of how we conceive conceptions of why live, how to live, what is a good life, what ought we to hope for, those basic questions that each and every one of us must come to terms with as we face our inescapable and unavoidable extinction of some sort. The radical democratic tradition, the black freedom movement as one version among others, is an attempt to institutionalize critiques of authority to ensure that arbitrary uses of power are checked or curtailed. It believes that there are Promethean energies among ordinary people, if unleashed, produces possibilities heretofore overlooked and ignored and downplayed. Notion that ordinary people are capable of ruling and being ruled in turn. That's Aristotle's definition of a citizen in the politics. It puts a premium on alternation of rule and rotation of rulers, trying to set in place conditions for democracy, that freedom of movement and association and expression and separation of powers, be it judiciary, executive, or legislative, or other means by which some mechanism of accountability can be institutionalized. And to come up with ways in which representation can somehow channel the voices of people as populations expand. Make distinctions between a nation state and a civil society so that ordinary citizens never feel helpless and hopeless, but rather can always organize and mobilize and bring power and pressure to bear. Why is this so very important? It's very important because how rare it is that there have been democratic experiments in the history of the human adventure, and they usually don't last that long. They are usually short-lived. And when they begin to unravel, it usually takes the form of increasing poverty that produces escalating levels of despair and increasing paranoia that produces escalating levels of distrust. Poverty, paranoia. Despair, distrust. To talk about race in the United States is to talk about poverty and paranoia, is to talk about despair and distrust, which means to talk about race then in the United States is to take us to the very heart and core of crisis in this experiment called American democracy. To talk about a race is not to talk about some marginalized issue, some ghettoized issue, some set of issues that are confined to chocolate cities. No, not at all. For those who fundamentally believe experiment called American democracy still has possibilities, meaning that one must come to terms with white supremacy and its legacy. John J. Chapman put it so well when he says, white supremacy, the issue of race, was very much like a serpent wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the Declaration of Independence was signed by the Founding Fathers. It haunted the experiment then, and it has been haunting this experiment ever since. Challenge becomes, can we keep the radical democratic tradition alive? Can we keep one version of it alive, the black freedom movement? We can talk about the feminist movement, the womanist movement. It highlights another form of, in my mind, illegitimate authority, male supremacy. Talk about the workers' movement as it attempts to keep track of management and corporate elites and banking elites. We talk about the anti-homophobic movement as it attempts to stay in touch with the humanity of gay brothers and lesbian sisters of all colors. As I noted, my first acquaintance with the radical democratic tradition had to do with coming to terms with my own psychic scars and existential bruises and ontological wounds as a result of white supremacist bombardment. So it raises a question. Can we keep this radical democratic tradition alive? We keep in mind, of course, the words of T.S. Eliot, his famous essay of 1919, Tradition and Individual Talent, where he wrote, tradition is not something you inherit. If you want it, you must obtain it with great labor. And so it is with the radical democratic tradition of the Black freedom movement. You don't inherit tradition. It must be fought for through intellectual toil and existential engagement and political contestation. Every generation has to fundamentally rejuvenize and regenerate this tradition. Can we do it in the latter part of the 20th century as the oldest surviving democracy in the last empire of this ghastly century in which over 200 million brothers and sisters across the globe have been murdered in the name of some vicious ideology of some sort? It's a gargantuan task. Yet we can do no other than to take it on. Now, let me mention one other point before I move into an analysis of the present conditions under which this tradition will either stay alive or will wane. And it's this, that what sits at the very center of the Black freedom movement, the fundamental tension, and you see it in one of the first great classics, namely David Walker's Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World. It was published in September of 1829. Most of you know he died in a hotel in Boston just about an hour away, 4 years later. Often the consequence of those who are willing to sacrifice and serve the movement. But David Walker raised a fascinating question. He begins in that tract by talking about Thomas Jefferson. He says, when I read the Declaration of Independence, I am deeply moved. Here we have, in fact, some grand words that has much to do with the plight of ordinary people around the world. Thomas Jefferson is, in fact, a grand democratic theorist, he says. But he also notes, of course, that Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder. He says, must I out-Jeffersonize Jefferson? Call for the democratizing of this experiment called American democracy, given that 21% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies when they declared independence were people of African descent, majority of whom were enslaved. Or is it the case, David Walker asked, that American democracy does not have the capacity to actually become a genuinely multiracial democracy? That in fact, American democracy may in fact itself presuppose the subordination of people of African descent. That its very stability and continuity may be predicated on black subordination. Of course, for 87 years, in this experiment, that certainly was the case. Inheritable and perpetual slavery. What Orlando Patterson of Harvard College calls natal alienation, alienated at birth, in which one has no rights, owing to the fact that one is born a slave, no legal status, no social standing, no public worth, only of economic value, degraded, devalued, dishonored, subject to violent punishment and vicious put down. Also subject to that brutish contingency of the slave auction, at which any second one may be sold, or one's loved one sold, one's mother, one's father, one's child. 87 years at the very center of a democratic experiment. David Walker, quite ambivalent. Either one democratizes American democracy and believes with John Dewey that in fact the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy, or one is profoundly pessimistic about the ability of American democracy ever to fundamentally democratize itself such that black folk gain equal access and black humanity is actually believed to rest alongside that of others. That deep pessimism of David Walker, a particular kind of black nationalist politics that claims that those radical Democrats may be wasting their time in calling for expansion of the scope of democratic practices and procedures as it relates to people of African descent. And you can imagine 1865. No one different. Freedom, capital F, small f. And for 11 years there was a moment in the sun in which there were indeed genuine attempts to create a multiracial democracy, keeping in mind there were more black senators then than there are now. 1877 up to 1964. Jim Crow, Jane Crow, segregation, second-class citizenship. For 49 years, every 2.5 days, some black child, a black woman, a black man hanging from some tree, that strange fruit that Southern trees bear that Billie Holiday sang about, reinforcing the pessimism. Maybe it is the case that American democracy, as grand as any experiment in democracy is, maybe it is the case that it is not for people of African descent. Malcolm X used to say, standing on the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, that black people were the perpetual victims of American democracy, and American democracy could not survive without that oxymoronic stance of black folk being victims of American democracy, and he decided it was time to go, it was time to separate. Marcus Garvey reached the same conclusion in the 20s and led the largest mass movement of black folk in the history of this country to leave the country right at a time when most of the world wanted to come to America. How different. What a contrast. Echoing that line, Josephine Baker, her memoir, when she writes, the very idea of America makes me shake and tremble and gives me nightmares. Not too many people say that. Indigenous people, yes. Not too many people could say that about the idea of America associated with liberty and opportunity and democracy. David Walker's tension affects each and every radical Democrat and black freedom fighter precisely because the pessimism pulls on one side. The pessimism that says America will never muster the will to racial justice. There will always be ruin and disaster for vast millions of black folk, even as American society flowers and flourishes. And on the other hand, the claim that that pessimism must not be a conclusion but a challenge. Serious challenge. That pessimism cannot be right. If it is, what is the alternative? Another nation somewhere else? Or is the alternative that if that pessimism continues to grow with the despair and distrust, that the slow but sure unraveling of the democratic experiment, precious but precarious, looms large for each and every one of us. That was a challenge that was raised in the 1960s, not just by Martin King, but by Fannie Lou Hamer, by Robert Moses and a host of others. How serious are we about democracy? If we're not serious about it, then let's say so. It's not just a matter of race as individual prejudice. It's ultimately a matter of acknowledging the degree to which the poverty and paranoia that race signifies is growing in our day. So we turn into the present moment, what do we see? Well, on the one hand, we see relative economic decline. We see downward mobility. We see social slippage. We see outright immiseration among millions of Americans across race and across region. We see the downsizing of an American middle class. A social structure that once looked like a diamond begins to look like an hourglass. Downward mobility always brings out the worst in each and every one of us. We begin to look for scapegoats. It's human, all too human to usually target the most vulnerable members of a community as the cause for one's downward mobility. I was just there. I was out in Cairo, Illinois, just a couple of weeks ago, trying to convince some deeply conservative white male fellow citizens that black folk were not responsible for the closing down of the factory, which resulted in the loss of their jobs. How many factories black people own in East Cairo? There's none. Well, why were you upset? It was affirmative action that somehow did it. You don't want to look up. You want to look across, down the social ladder. And we hear it all the time. Oh, if the women had just stayed in the kitchen, the culture would be intact. The gay brothers and lesbian sisters that stayed in the closet, the morality would be intact. Human, all too human. Don't want to face the tragic facts, looking for modes of evasion and avoidance, and usually coming up with some kind of conspiratorial theory, which is always a kissing cousin of a paranoid situation. Things are out of control. If we had some simple theory of who is in control, we can gain some control. Human, all too human. But the relative economic decline is real. It makes it very, very difficult to keep alive a radical democratic tradition at a time in which people have to look out more and more for number one because it looks as if no one is looking out for them. This is especially true among ordinary people. The last 14 years, we've seen a redistribution of wealth going upward. Upward at a time in which more and more persons are experiencing downward mobility. Not just regressive taxation, not just cutbacks and slowdowns in social programs to disadvantage, not just take-backs and give-backs, negotiation table between working people and management, but 225% increase in salaries of corporate executives at a time when plants are closing and workers are laid off and benefits are slashed. The one assumption of the radical democratic tradition is that poor people don't choose to be poor. They had a voice in decision-making processes and institutions that affect them. They would choose to have access to food and shelter and health care and child care, a decent paying job. Now, it's true, I've got good friends who've taken vows of poverty, but I don't think it's going to become a mass movement soon. So some kind of blockage is taking place. Some kind of hemorrhaging is taking place here. And yet there's no public debate at all about wealth. Thank God for Derek Bach's new book, The Cost of Talent. I highly recommend it. Or whether there's a causal link with Derek Bach leaving the presidency of Harvard and writing such a fine book. I was writing it 5 years ago. But 1% of the population owns 48% of total financial wealth in the nation. 1% of the population owning 36% of the household net wealth in the nation. That sounds oligarchic. Sounds plutocratic. To some degree, pigmentocratic. 45% population owns 2% of the wealth, but it's unconstitutional for the federal government to tax wealth and only tax income. We have a budget crunch. Let's put it on over. Let's have a discussion. Let's inform the American people. Put the charts up. Might be arguments to justify that kind of distribution of wealth. I'm a Democrat. I'm open to these various arguments. But my hunch is that without that kind of serious public debate, at 45% struggling over that 2% of the wealth, begin more and more to fight over these huge but still significant crimes. Relative economic decline. Yes, we talk about economic recovery, and recovery is real in terms of the number of jobs, but once we actually analyze what kind of job, Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, part-time jobs, hardly any pensions, hardly any benefits at all. And of course, more and more women forced into the labor force in order to sustain the family income, given the fact that real inflation-adjusted wages have declined since 1978. 19%, Wallace Peterson said. In the black community, we have seen a depression, a slow-motion, silent depression ravaging levels of destruction and self-destruction and death and disease. Infant mortality rate in Harlem is worse than in Bangladesh. You all heard that. That's real. The richest nation in the history of the world. A depression, 1960, for example, among young black men between 16 and 21, 40% had decent paying industrial jobs. 1994, 6.7%. As a result of deindustrialization, of industrial flight, the loss of those industrial jobs which served as the backbone for the very economic lifeblood of a community. Deindustrialization has not affected black people alone, not at all. It's a world historical process owing to the reconstruction of the global economy after 1973, after the end of Americans' uncontested economic power as a competition. Japanese and then West Germans and even Brazilians. I say even because people don't expect so-called third world nations to be in on the competition. And by third world, I simply mean where the majority of humanity live and die. Relative economic decline. Given the relative economic decline, how does one keep alive a radical democratic tradition? Let's keep that question. Let's look at the undeniable cultural decay, which is inseparable but not identical with the relative economic decline. And by undeniable cultural decay, I'm talking, of course, about the creeping zeitgeist of a cold-heartedness and mean-spiritedness that is more and more pervasive in our time. Talking about what it means to live in a crystallized market culture with its market moralities and market mentalities. A market culture that evolves around buying and selling and promoting and advertising. A market morality that views access to power and pleasure and property, sometimes by any means, as the appropriate end and aim. A market mentality that fundamentally posits self-indulgent pleasure, hedonism, self-interested action, egoism, as the dominant conception of the good life. A culture of consumption that promotes an addiction to stimulation and titillation. Feeling down and out? Go to the mall, consume, feel better about yourself. Bring your credit card, of course. Or turn on the television and engage in that spectatorial passivity in which those moving images and sound bombard you and make you feel as if you're vital and vibrant because you felt a little dead before you turned it on. With the commercials increasing all the time to consume, consume. And keep in mind, a market economy is different than a market culture. A market economy has to do, of course, with trying to deal with a highly differentiated population and price mechanisms to mediate supply and demand. Adam Smith understood the difference. He wrote Wealth of Nations to defend a market economy, but he wrote a theory of moral sentiments that said a market culture cannot sustain a market economy. Contract, crucial for market economy, means nothing without truth-telling and promise keeping. A market culture, which more and more people feel as if to be alive is to be engaged in a social Darwinian struggle for survival of the fittest. William O'Neill, one of the grand disciples of Arnold Toynbee, said it well when he said, the distinctive feature of the decline of any civilization is the erosion of the nurturing system for children. Certainly one of the dominant characteristics of our time is the erosion of the nurturing system for children. Recall what the FCC figure said in 1991 when they deregulated television. Said the marketplace will take care of our children. Recent study, 21 hours young people watching television, 1.8 hours of reading, 3.2 hours homework. The marketplace will take care of our children. Meaning what? Meaning that it's going to be very difficult in a market culture to sustain the institutions that transmit non-market value. This is often talked about in terms of a crisis of the family. And the crisis of the family is very, very real across the board. Divorce rates for white male professionals, 70%. Divorce rate for black males in inner city, 72%. The family is in deep trouble. But those who have actually raised children when the nuclear family was a bit more intact know that it always takes more than two to raise a child. You need grandmothers and grandfathers and aunts and uncles and friends in the neighborhood and little league coaches and dance teachers and Sunday school teachers and rabbis and ministers. You need a whole set of persons, a network, a supportive network. You all know the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. The erosion of the nurturing system for children is not simply a question of the family, of neighborhood, of civic infrastructure, civic association that themselves are eroding. And the result is, as one can imagine, more and more experiences for all of us, but especially young people, of social deracination and cultural denudement. By social deracination, I mean rootlessness, a sense of drifting, living life as a series of random nows and fortuitous moments. No sense of a larger project, no sense of a larger direction, which means that transmitting meaning, value, direction, and orientation, quest for excellence, quest for elegance, push to the mark. Non-market values like love and care and concern and service to others, a service to something bigger than oneself, push to the periphery. Non-market values like community and loyalty and trust and commitment. Even in our intimate relations, kindness and gentleness and sweetness. You know, when I was coming along, we used to dance in garages. Pleasant memory of that. There was a song by Otis Redding called Try a Little Tenderness. More and more push to the margins. It's all about performance now. How was it? Good to you. We're into bodily stimulation. stimulation rather than nourishment, titillation rather than existential empowerment, which is a result of communion rather than sheer bumping up against one's body with another. On the intimate level, novelists and others, of course, talk about this. The playwrights probably are best in terms of talking about the spiritual impoverishment as a result of the cultural decay. But most important, it means it becomes very difficult to create the fundamental precondition for keeping a radical democratic tradition or the black freedom struggle alive, which is the creation of a public life which is attractive and appealing to people. And given the legacy of white supremacy, in which the residential patterns, the patterns of social life, are more racially segregated now, or as much as they were in the 60s. This is what Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton have just put forward in their recent book on segregation in America. It balkanizes, segments, fragments, creates enclaves, so that the paranoia, the closing ranks mentality, the distrust is reinforced. Given that kind of polarization with market sensibilities, how can there be a vital public life which is requisite for a vibrant democracy? John Dewey said it so well in his classic of 1927, The Public and Its Problem. One sign of the decay of a democracy is when public life is associated with squalor, something to run from. And again, boom, here comes race again. Think of public education these days, who do we think of? Black and brown kids. Nothing to run from. Public education, so much of it decrepit. Public provision, we don't think of subsidies to corporations. We think of welfare. Then that most vicious of images to emerge in the last 15 years or so, this notion of a welfare queen. To think that a particular group of fellow citizens in this country, black women, probably one of the, if not the hardest working group in the history of this nation. Double work, 1900s, 70% of black women working in white households, raising white kids as well as their own kids. 1945, 42% were still working in white households, raising white kids and their own kids. And they become the symbol of ripping off the U.S. nation state. They become the symbol of being lazy and idle and shiftless. How hypocritical. How base. Public safety, black men. Fear and a disproportionate amount of crimes committed by black folk. Public conversation. So very important for a grand institution like Clark University. What happens to public conversations at such a moment? Degenerates in the name calling, finger pointing, the clash of identities, of constituents. The very idea of public-mindedness itself is held at arm's length. It's just a matter of letting off that steam and letting people know what one's agenda actually is, or coming up with various strategies of manipulation. Martin Buber once said that one distinctive mark of dialogue is you ought to be a little different when you leave than when you enter. How often does that take place in public conversation? That precious activity of communication taking place among citizens, mediated by civility and mutual respect. As the art of public conversation is more and more lost, communication breaks down, the polarization becomes more and more reinforced. And in the black community, of course, more and more takes the form of that pessimism that I talked about. The various varieties of black nationalism. Black nationalism certainly has some truths of black self-love, black self-help, black self-development, fundamental for the black freedom struggle. But that same pessimism, that same black nationalism tends to say, We have given up on the possibility of entering a public space with other citizens. Multiracial alliance and coalition is a thing of the past. That's played out. That died April 4th, 1968 with Martin Luther King was murdered. And those 187 rebellions took place that night. And that traumatic shock that still is felt in black America, trying to get over the deep pessimism. What is a radical Democrat like myself to do? To look it in the face. That there must be a way of getting that over, but through it. Because of peculiar political lethargy in which people have lost faith in public institutions to do anything right. Lost faith in public life being associated with any kind of achievement and accomplishment. Leaves us then with a barren and vacuous public life. And to talk about race matters and agree to which race matters. And to talk about that poverty and paranoia and unraveled democracies. To talk about the despair and distrust. And to talk about how can we come up with ways of reconstituting a public conversation and debate about some deep public problems that affect each and every one of us. Once we actually acknowledge that our destinies are inextricably interwoven together, that we're on the same boat, on the same turbulent sea, and it has a leak in it. We all go up together, we all go down together. Hang together, or we hang separately. Regardless of what we wish, because history is not dictated by what we simply wish. We have to respond to circumstances not of our own choosing. And for me, the only way in which we could actually reconstitute the kind of public conversation and ultimately public life and ultimately new forms of public action, of organizing and mobilizing, is fourfold, and I'll conclude. First, we have to pursue something that is actually quite un-American. This is a sense of history. A deep, abiding, subtle, sophisticated sense of history. We keep track of the ambiguous legacies and the hybrid cultures, and we can see that no society or civilization has a monopoly on truth or virtue. We can actually see the degree to which the culture that we find ourselves is thoroughly shot through with not just those ambiguous legacies, but also that hybridity, that cross-cultural fertilization, the way in which to be a white American is to have a deep African-American dimension in who and what you are, owing to the way in which you've been socialized and acculturated in this society. It is not just a matter of watching Arsenio or Oaks or Michael Jordan, though that's part of it. And a reader which a New World African like myself, an African American like myself, no matter how African I view myself, that I dream in English. I don't choose to. But that when I listen to a John Coltrane, I know that he's playing a European instrument in a way that no European ever played it before. Because he's New World African. And the jazz itself is one of the great creations itself, very much a democratic art form, was a result of this hybrid culture. Culture of mix and messiness. That sense of history is so very important, because if in fact we're able to keep track of the complexity of the past and the relation of the past to the present, and we can situate ourselves within a larger story that relates the present to the past and allows us to project a much broader future. We can locate ourselves within some narratives that have to do with that past, and how difficult that is to do in a market culture. So much of history in a market culture comes back as isolated icon. Martin Luther King on the pedestal. No, there's no king without SCLC, without Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He's a wave in an ocean. He's not Superman. Or Malcolm X on a pedestal. No, there's no Malcolm X. That Nation of Islam first in his brain. History has to do with extraordinarily ordinary people, each and every one of us struggling, contesting, transacting with environment in order to weave webs of meaning and significance, and to create communities, networks of love and care and concern. Deep sense of history is so badly needed. Henry Ford is wrong. He's wrong on so many subjects. He's certainly wrong when he said history is bunk. Went on to merchandise an automobile with its mobility and individuality. How American. Get away! Ralph Waldo Emerson says everything good is on the highway. The cosmos is on wheels. How American. Huck likes to stay on the boat, doesn't he? Keep moving, as if he can escape from history. But history's right there. Jim is right there, standing in the face. Ahab on the ship. You just keep moving. No. Melville's too deep to allow any escapes from history. History's right there on the ship. Curiac on the road. History follows. Sarah Vaughan is on and off the beats. She knows that history follows her. She's part of a tradition that builds upon that which came before, going about that Mount Zion Baptist Church that produced her in Newark, New Jersey. In other words, a sense of history is a fundamental element of reconstituting a public conversation so that we recognize that our histories are not separate, aren't compartmentalized. We highlight the relations and connections, the links and the bonds in our history. If there's any serious history, must talk about not just slaves, but slaveholders, must talk about not just workers, but owners of property, not just men, but women. There's no such history of any group without acknowledging the relation to the other. Already we're beginning to acknowledge. When we talk about public and links and bonds, a sense of history can facilitate a focus on those links and bonds. And one would hope that that sense of history would allow us to expand the scope of empathy and compassion. Simone Weil was absolutely right when she said, love of thy neighbor and all of its fullness means being able to say to him or her, what are you going through and what are you up against? Sense of history would allow us to identify with the anxieties and frustrations of others. Sense of history ought to be able to allow us to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes and get inside of their skin so we can not just castigate, but more importantly, we can criticize with a sense of what the circumstances are that they're dealing with. That's part of a high-quality public conversation. And then the self-criticism, which is so crucial. Sense of history allows us to see that any claim that we put forward is fallible, never immune to revision, always subject to serious scrutiny. We hear Socrates, unexamined life is not worth living. Malcolm X adds, examine life. It's painful, full of risk, full of vulnerability. Self-criticism is not a game. It is a form of courage. It takes tremendous amounts of courage to criticize yourself. Or as Nietzsche put it, having the courage not simply of one's convictions, but the courage to attack one's convictions. That's how you grow and develop. That's part of a public conversation. You could be wrong. Last but not least, this moment of fatalism and pessimism and cynicism for so many, as we feel often powerless and impotent, some reaching a conclusion that we're sliding down a slippery slope to chaos and anarchy. Certainly true for certain pockets in this nation at this very moment. We need a sense of audacious hope. Can't be a black freedom fighter, can't be a radical Democrat without a sense of audacious hope. A sense of history and expansion of scope of empathy and self-critical, courageous stance means we have to come up with ways of convincing one another that we can make a difference, and what we think and what we do can make a difference. And we can do that only when we energize and galvanize one another. Audacious hope is not to be confused with optimism. I am in no way optimistic. Very interesting. So many of those views of race matters. And Cornel West, optimist. So nice to have black optimists around. I'm not optimistic at all. When I look at the evidence, it in no way allows me to infer that things are going to get better. But I'm a prisoner of hope. That's something else. Prisoner of hope makes Pascalian leaps of faith beyond the evidence. The mental and moral capacities of everyday people can be brought together in such a way that we can cut against the grain. That white brothers and sisters can cut against a white supremacist grain. That men can cut against a male supremacist grain. That straight folk can cut against a homophobic grain. That radical Democrats can cut against the grain of history, which is thoroughly anti-democratic in its tilt. And the dominant tendencies of our day, the nativisms and chauvinisms and jingoisms and ugly nationalisms, thoroughly anti-democratic, idolatrous. And yet we need a sense of audacious hope to cut against that grain, even when we look at a Bosnia, or when we look at an India or South Africa or East Los Angeles or an Appalachia, Kentucky or Harlem. Audacious hope. Believing against the evidence, against the odds, and against the grain. The world is incomplete, the history is unfinished. The future is open-ended. It is always dawn, the day breaks forever. Above the eastern horizon at this very moment, somewhere the sun is now about the peak. We can seize that crack, that window of opportunity, by appealing to something greater and grander than us, that takes us beyond our own petty focuses. Something called the public, with its balance with the private. Something called the public that recognizes our links. Then we can, as has been the case in the 1890s and the 1930s and the 1960s, when ordinary people said, I'm going to keep my head to the sky. I'm going to keep, as Mahalia Jackson used to sing, my hand on the plow. I'm going to keep, as the freedom fighters of all colors in the 60s used to say, my eyes not on each other, but on the prize. Something that appeals to the best in each and every one of us, what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Fundamental challenge. It has been the challenge of every generation. It will be up to us to meet that challenge. And if we know, as I hope we do, that we will not save the world, we can certainly leave it a little bit better than we found it. T.S. Eliot says in the fourth quartet, ours is in the trying. The rest is not our business. That we will not create paradise or utopia. We certainly can transform some of the prevailing kinds of social misery that render so many ordinary people invisible, and certainly in this country have rendered so many ordinary people of African descent invisible. So I said to Clark University, for those of you who attempt to meet that challenge, I'll be there with you, but I'm going down fighting. Thanks. Comments or what have you? Yes, how you doing today?
In Race Matters, you spoke quite a bit about the importance for race transcending prophets. And you spoke about Harold Washington Jesse Jackson in the 1988 campaign. But nowhere did you mention the ability for whites or other races to be race transcending prophets. Is there space for this? Are we open-minded enough for it?
Sure. No, appreciate that question. Certainly, I mean, race transcending prophecy is open. Prophetic activity is open to anybody. Because in that particular chapter, I was talking about the crisis of black leadership. I was confining my critique to a variety of different black leaders and different kinds of black leaders. When we look at present-day white leadership or Euro-American leadership, certainly Bill Bradley comes to mind right away. That is to say, somebody who's been quite explicit in his critiques of white supremacy and been courageous enough to air them at times when it was highly unpopular. Now, there are a number of Bill Bradley-like figures at the grassroots level. One thinks, for example, of Industrial Areas Foundation movement. A whole host of white freedom fighters who are taking on white supremacy and linking it to issues of economic inequality and critiques of patriarchy and so on. So that in that chapter I was talking primarily, as you know, just about black leadership, but oh my God, very much so, this notion. And of course, by race transcending, what I mean is never forgetting the significance of race, but refusing to be confined to it. So we're not talking about somehow thinking that we can just transcend race by acts of our minds, as the history of the effects and consequences of white supremacy continue to shape so many of the perceptions, sensibilities, orientations, residential patterns of fellow citizens. But I'm talking about a certain kind of act of imagination. And this is what visionary leadership is. It's an act of imagination that allows persons to hear something positive about themselves and what is being said, and therefore they begin to be galvanized and reach the conclusion they're willing to make sacrifices for it. A very, very difficult thing to do. But most of us have very short lives. And if we feel as if it's David versus Goliath, I have too much trust in Yahweh or God or Jehovah or whatever, then it's best just to cultivate one's garden like Voltaire's thinking. Well, I'll do mine. Certain moments, certain kind of imagination can be projected through visionary leadership, so people recognize, lo and behold, the issues that I am fundamentally concerned about are part of this vision. But the vision is not confined solely to those issues, and therefore it takes us beyond ourselves in terms of getting beyond the kind of egoism and narcissism that I was alluding to earlier. And that's very much what I meant by someone like a Harold Washington, for example, who was very much part of the radical democratic tradition that I'm talking about. Of course, Reverend Jesse Jackson, I would say, on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, he tends to tilt in my direction. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he's a little different. That is to say, he's quite improvisational in ways that can be problematic. But God bless him. He's very courageous. Very much so.
And my question involves you were talking about the deindustrialization of capital flight out of the United States, and my question would be, I would imagine you'd be opposed to NAFTA for what you were saying, but seeing this shift on a global level towards increased capital flight, how do you intend to reindustrialize the country or to promote a kind of, a long-term growth of the country, seeing the shift there, this shift from a manufacturing economy to a service economy?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think the first thing one tries to do is to generate policies that can bend consumption toward investment. Investment not simply in ways of reconstructing family and community, which is to say trying to provide certain child supports, trying to provide certain support for civic infrastructure, but job training, job creation. And that investment would have to take the form of keeping track of the new waves of job creation in microtechnology and biotechnology, microelectronics and biotechnology, and in telecommunications and so forth.
So it would have, the job training and job creation would have to be attuned to the new spheres that are linked now more and more to what kind of employment one will see in the next 10 to 20, 30 years or so. But that can only take place if there's some significant investment, which is to encourage private investment among firms and enterprises and corporations and so forth. And of course, for there to be some kind of public investment as well. I think beyond that, I think also we're going to have to talk about restructuring the wage system so that those who are playing such fundamental roles in our public life, public servants, for example, teachers, for example, will feel as if they are valued, and a significant amount of investment in public infrastructure, educational system, will itself be able to generate a certain amount of jobs, not a whole, so it's in no way a panacea or a solution to the situation, but a certain amount of jobs for public servants who more and more feel devalued, feel more and more that they're hitting their head up against the wall, as it were, as they deal with some of the very, very, as you can imagine, atrocious side effects of the crisis that I'm talking about every day. So that I think in the long run, actually, one is going to have to talk about a kind of global strategy of investment in physical infrastructure, civic infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, and so on. But that's the old north-south policy that Brent was putting forward in the 80s that I think actually still makes a lot of sense. The best treatment of this is in Michael Harrington's last book, his 18th book. This is the great Michael Harrington, Democratic Socialists of America, and so forth. His book on socialism, past and future. And by socialism, he doesn't mean any narrow ideological constructed regime that regiments and represses its population. By socialism, he means the name for human hope for justice under the unprecedented conditions of the 21st century. He's got a very delicate relation to private and public sphere and so on. But he has a much more elaborate response to how one fleshes out this talk about investment. Lesser Thoreau, and of course, and Bob Cutler and a few others have written about this as well. But I believe that we're going to have to talk seriously about coming up with ways of investing in people, community, and so on. Now, of course, President Clinton talked about this. But since he's been in office, he's got a budget deficit, significant issue. National Public Service, we had a number of weeks over the summer, which is very important, to bring young people together from different walks of life to constitute some kind of form of public service, very much resonating with my talk about reconstructing public life. Too many young people these days live such parochial lives. Same neighborhood, same friends, same conversation, same dialogue. You have to bump up against people with different walks of life. You don't have a military experience, which was the case for so many older persons who had to take showers with working class folk when you were upper middle class. That can be quite refreshing. In so many ways. That's what public life is. Citizens are different. People are different. You don't just watch them on TV. You interact with flesh and blood, different people. So that's one of the things Clinton's trying to do, but he's still making just very early embryonic gestures in this regard. The third, of course, is welfare reform, and it doesn't look too good on that front. It seems to me not at all. It seems to be deeply conservative. You're trying to steal the thunder from conservatives, but if you're going to steal thunder in that way, you might as well become one for a while. But last but not least was stimulus investment. And as you know, the bill died on the floor of the Senate in March. I don't think he fought for it, so. I think he's still interested in it. I think there's still a chance for it. But that was the fourth item, lowest priority, but was crucial for the campaign. Because I think actually he was on the right track in terms of trying to generate both levels of competition to deal with the very brutal world economy, where the competition, of course, is tilted in certain directions, and various nations have certain kinds of arrangements that ensure that their levels of competition are sustained. But he's yet to follow through on it. The best concrete policies that have been at least trotted out have been the budget of the Black Congressional Caucus and the Progressive Caucus as well. The Paul Wellstones. Does that begin to get at your question?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Sure, you're coming. Come
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm just concerned over. I guess my greatest concern is over I see shift to a service economy. You see greater deviation between the guy who's working at Microsoft and the guy who's working at McDonald's. There's a huge deviation in that, and I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of studying into what can be done to mediate that. And it concerns me a lot because you're seeing greater and greater. You're seeing that 1% gain more and more and more wealth, and that concerns me a lot. And there seems to be this push, especially by Clinton, with NAFTA, with export-based economy, with increased investment. It was two days last week. They talked about U.S. investment in Colombia, U.S. investment in Chile, and it concerns me that there seems to be this continual investment outside of America.
Yeah.
So that concerns me a lot, and I just wonder what you had to say about it.
I think for a very good reason. I mean, keep in mind, though, that the group that Robert Reich called symbolic analysts constitute roughly about 18 to 20%. So we're talking about increase of income for the top 20%, not just the 1%. The 1% primarily have to do with the wealth that I was talking about. In terms of expansion of income, augmentation of income, it's about the 18 to 20%. Professional managerial class, who did wonderfully in the 80s. They were in on the party and had a great time. But the 40% who experienced downward mobility and the 20% who barely sustain their footing are those who have high level of material insecurity and anxiety, and rightly so. I am deeply disturbed about this disparity that you're talking about, and that's partly what I had in mind when I talked about restructuring of a wage system. Beginning with increase of minimum wage. We can lift 220,000 out of poverty just with the increase of minimum wage. Robert Reich trots it out and takes it back. He trots it out and takes it back. We'll get to it soon. He takes it back. And there's arguments, of course, on both sides in terms of small businesses having to survive in ways in which you could subsidize small businesses to increase minimum wage to lift working poor out of poverty. 18% of the labor force in America are working poor, which means they exemplify Protestant ethic, they prefer gratification, they're frugal, they're thrifty, they work hard, and they still live in poverty. They receive not one penny public provision whatsoever. They're still living in poverty. That's almost 1 out of 5 workers in the American economy. Something is deeply wrong. Those persons who are giving so much and working so hard still feel as if they're running up against a cul-de-sac at a dead end. Can you imagine a sense of powerlessness, what I was alluding to earlier? Sense of it. I'm sorry to go on and on, that's a very important point. But I would take a look at Michael Harrington's book if you haven't had a chance to. Because usually that's not part of the mainstream curriculum. You know what I mean? And it's nice to have these iconoclastic voices who worked with Billy Brandt for 25 years and so forth, trying to deal with this problem of investment on a global scale and how it relates to the domestic component of the global economy. So, you sure go ready?
For me, I found, I enjoyed the talk. And one of the things that you said on public conversation piqued my interest because I've been involved in some of the conversations we have, these fireside chats we're trying to have with at least once or twice a month. And we sit there at Clark just to have chats to talk to people and get the issues out. And we did this Thursday, hey, Kim worked on it. And we were there and we were trying to talk about racial issues and concerns towards students and how things work on that. And it was very difficult for us to talk about these things because we didn't know what would be appropriate, what terms to use, how to express ourselves. And you seemed to hint that you had some understanding of that. I was wondering if you could go more into that, just that bit of the conversation.
See, my hunch is one of the reasons why it's so very difficult to be candid and frank is but because of the levels of distrust, we've got to come up with ways of forging bonds of trust that would allow people to say things that would be off the wall, rather silly, sometimes nonsensical. That's what it is to be human too, right? If you have a marriage where you can't say anything nonsensical or silly, you've got a problem. And of course, marriage is not the paradigm for relationships and struggle all the time, but we can learn much from those relationships in which bonds of trust allow for persons to say a number of different things because it's very clear that their motivations and their intentions are not being called into question. And so, in many ways, public conversation is very much like skiing. You got to learn how to do it by doing it. Keep doing it. And do it in such a way that persons can, in fact, reach certain levels of trust where certain more honest words can be exchanged, as it were. I mean, for example, in the exchange that you all had, what was it about your more honest exchanges as opposed to the less honest one? I'd like to know, just an empirical question, actually.
Well, trying to think. Most of the more honest exchanges, the ones that we seem to think were more honest exchanges were like testimonials, relating experiences that you had, and they left to it was more of a statement. Mm-hmm. They didn't leave room. They didn't seem to leave room for comment back. Right? You would finish a statement and you'd say, "Well, how better could I have reacted?" And no one knew, no one could continue the conversation. So the conversation would end when you wait for someone else to come up with their testimony. And then you would listen to everyone's testimonials. And from that, we were supposed to feel, at the end of those testimonials, we were supposed to feel that we had a good conversation. If nothing comes out of that, because all you hear are other people's experiences, you don't get to...
You see, that strikes me, though, as trying to set in place one of those conditions for the possibility of public conversation. Name a sense of history. You want to know a sense of people's personal history, their narratives, what they've been up against, and so forth, how they perceive what they've been up against. That becomes raw ingredients for a public conversation. But I mean, you get a sense of who people are, right? So you can empathize, what I was talking about before. But it's true, you must get beyond just the testimonies, but the testimonies are going to be very important in terms of one walking down the road toward high-quality public conversation. Because you're not going to have public conversation if you really don't know each other. No matter what, you might have chit-chat. But you won't have the kind of public conversation I'm talking about. So it's a process. It's a very long, protracted, painful process, but it is a process. It's good to know that process is going on in this particular form. I'm sure it's going on in other forms as well here at Clark. But yeah, no, indeed. That's all we're all doing is trying the short time we have here. Very much so.
Hello. Well, picking up on Dave's point, if we agree that language connotates meaning and that various cultures, various social groups have their own languages, and that it's ours to respect and try to understand those languages, but it's not ours to try and interpret them according to our own perspective or our own experiences. How then does political correctness, that whole movement, help us or hurt us?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the question. I mean, one is that, for me, I don't believe in any wholesale incommensurability of languages. And I do believe that interpretation is an inescapable element in understanding. Therefore, any attempt of persons to understand other persons within the same language, across language, and so forth, will be shot through with an interpretive element. And so I think it is very important that as we understand languages, we in no way fall into the same kind of balkanization and fragmentation, be it under the rubric of certain kind of sophomoric relativism, in which somebody has one language, someone has another language, we can't really communicate. We also recognize all forms of communication will have an element of misunderstanding. That's what makes communication perennial. All forms of communication can never be associated, identical, or synonymous with perfect understanding. There's going to be an element of misunderstanding here. So that, for me, political correctness is simply a way of saying two things. Political correctness says that there were certain kinds of discourses around in the university that could proliferate when, in fact, that university was more homogeneous and monolithic. It's like entering an old boy country club, certain language in the locker room. See, the Catholics came in, you had to shift a little bit, lighten up on the Pope. When the Jews came in, you had to do away with all those vicious anti-Semitic jokes that were often told in that country club. See, the women came in, some folks just ossified and petrified because they're so used to the women's jokes and put down, women's denigration. And so when black folk came in, they figured it's a revolution. See what I mean? And that's very much the history of American university in the last 35 years, especially elite institutions of higher learning. Very much so. And political correctness says, look, you cannot use this same kind of language precisely because it not only dehumanizing, but it is just outside of decency. Now, for me, I'm not one for codes and law. I think oftentimes law and codes are simply ways of appealing to regulating relationships when you're giving up on community. When you're giving up on certain forms of persuasion that have to do with decency and have to do with trying to relate to other persons so you get some external force that will force you to do it. That's one thing I think that the so-called PC does. The second thing it does, and this is what is dangerous, is that PC also can trump conversation, foreclose dialogue. Which means that those who do have different views, iconoclastic views, be it right or left, feel uneasy and feel as if they can't say what's on their mind. That's not good. You can't have a public conversation and everybody feels as if there's something on their mind and can't get it out because they feel as if they be PC'd. Not at all. It might be very bad arguments. Let's hear them. Let's hear them. It might be very truncated visions. Let's get them out. But of course, one has to confront them with arguments, and evidence, and so forth and so on. So I view PC in this twofold way, given the history, issues of community, sensitivity, and so on, and the ways in which one can truncate dialogue and conversation.
One thing about dialogues I've heard a lot here at Clark since I've come to teach here. I know you probably heard them too, because I've told Wanima about them, and she can kind of predict how these dialogues go. But usually between African American students and white students, and usually the white students are the guys who are going to come out and talk anyway because they feel like there's a problem on campus. But inevitably you hear an argument like this that goes, well, why can't we I just wish we didn't have to see people's skin color anymore. Why do we have to talk about skin color? And it'll be another set of good-hearted white student usually, or my colleagues on the faculty who says, there's this problem here with the black students. They got this black student union, and they want to sit together at lunch, and this isn't good on campus. What do you tell folks when they make those kinds of arguments? What's your response to arguments like that? I'm sure you can.
Yeah, good to see you. I appreciate the question. Let's start with the second one. I think that in many ways multi-contextualism is just as important or more important than multiculturalism. And what I mean by that is this, that each one of us function within a variety of different contexts. Some of those contexts are interracial, some of those contexts are intraracial, some of those contexts are professional, some of those contexts are non-professional, right across the board. The Newman Club, intra-religious. Hillel Society, intra-race/peoplehood. Peoplehood/religion, and so forth. There's going to be a variety of different contexts. I believe that we have to allow for a free flow of trafficking and traversing of these different contexts, because each and every one of us are going to feel different degrees of comfort in these different contexts. Now, given the fact that, as I said before, when black folk make their entree into these kinds of educational spaces, given the history, there's no doubt that one is not surprised to see certain levels of alienation and frustration. Feeling as if in some sense they're in exile. That is to say, feeling as if they're always under a white normative gaze and therefore being surveyed and wants to be in certain contexts in which they feel as if that gaze is not there. And one can choose different examples of such contexts. It could be the black students here. It could be going off to a black church. It could be sitting at tables in the cafeteria and so on. The danger is this, that once the multi-contextualism begins to degenerate, and I use that term deliberately, degenerate into not just an exclusivism, but a self-justifying parochialism that refuses to make any linkages with other contexts in which interactions across race, religion, region, and so forth take place. Then I think we have trouble. Then I think we have real trouble. Because it means then that we're actually reinforcing not just the balkanization, but balkanized perception, balkanized sensibilities, because the possibility of public space, again, is foreclosed. And that's true for any group. That's true for any group. So that, for example, if one walks into a cafeteria and you see black folk over here and you see white folk over here, and you say, well, hey, they're eating together fine. One hopes that in the lab they're together. One hopes that in athletics they're together. One hopes that in extracurricular activities beyond simply eating in a cafeteria and student government and the French club or whatever extracurricular activities they have, they are interacting with a variety of different persons. One hopes that when they're studying for that course in African history, European history, that they're studying with folk who are in the class, and one hopes that class itself is not thoroughly racialized and balkanized and so on. So it's different contexts. Once the multi-contextualism narrowed, no longer multi-generalized, then I think we have a problem. And that holds, I think, in some ways, actually, even more for white students than black students. Because my experience was, for example, at Harvard College, but there were very few white and black sisters who actually spent a lot of time in contexts where they had to interact with black folk. The black folk were interacting with them all the time. Had to. It's by sheer numbers. In classes and so forth. In the different clubs and what have you. And so it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to become multi-contextual. Back and forth. From striking up conversations to engaging in various kinds of projects across race and region. You had another question now, that first one. What was that question now?
Why can't we just say boys?
Oh, right, just be colorblind like Michael Jackson wants to be. Yeah. Leave the black Norway. But I mean, there's a very noble impulse, of course. That is to say, each and every one of us want to be human beings who want to be judged by the content of our character rather than something that's arbitrary and capricious. That's skin color, no doubt. But that's just how absurd white supremacy is, right? Or any form of xenophobia is. It picks out something that is so accidental and views it as essential. And therefore, the noble impulse behind wanting to be neither black nor white or any color is a noble impulse, but it's ahistorical. The world is not like that. So the question then becomes, how do we accent, stay in contact with the humanity of folk by recognizing that in a world in which race consciousness is so strong, that it is through one's whiteness and through one's blackness and through one's gender or through one's sexual orientation that one's humanity can be discerned, which is to say one can find that universality through the particular, rather than feeling as if somehow one can completely blind oneself to the particular and only see the universal. Somebody says, well, Brother West, we like your humanity, but your blackness we don't see. I say, when's the last time you looked at it? Yeah, you can't separate my body from my humanity. My humanity is not reduced to my body. But why would you want to hold my body at arm's length and somehow get at my essence? Why go Cartesian on me? You know. That in fact my humanity includes body, African, American, English-speaking, Luther Vandross liking. The whole thing, with all of its flaws, and with some of its goodies. And that's true for each and every one of us. And I think this notion of color blindness, after an ingraining of racial consciousness, slavery and Jim Crow and so forth, is a certain kind of ahistorical escape that is all so American. That sense of history I was talking about before. Well, sense of history, that's over. I get this all the time. Oh, that's over. Slavery, that's over. Jim Crow, that's over. When was it over? I don't know, but I look around, I don't see it now. But do you think it has some impact on the present? Cold War, that's over. November 1989, that's decades ago. That's over. You don't think it has an impact, the collapse of the Soviet Empire? It doesn't have an impact on the way, in fact, international relations are dictated these days? Of course it does. This is part of the challenge sense of history. But, as you can imagine, that same narrow, truncated, Manichaean sense of history can also lead toward tribalization. Can also lead toward the kind of balkanization that I was criticizing, though it is one notion. I think that was the tendency of our time, unfortunately. This is one of the things that radical Democrats must fight for. Remember Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line. That famous line, he shows the black folk. He's saying the struggle for democracy is going to take place against the backdrop of the ways in which white supremacy has been institutionalized and truncated America, democracy. Look in America how it's truncated. Look at the European maritime empires under imperialism and colonialism, how it's truncated, keeping track of the lives of ordinary people, the humanity of ordinary people. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line precisely because one of the major impediments of the struggle for democracy is the way in which white supremacy has created obstacles for it. And it's no accident that what many people consider the grand experiment in democracy in the modern period, which is not 1789 in France, but 1776. What's set at the center of it? The color line. 1994, 218 years later, walk the streets of the experiment. The color line. Shifted, different, rearticulated, but still at work. That's part of Du Bois's profundity in terms of his fundamental attachment to linking talk about race to struggle for democracy. Of course, Du Bois himself became quite despairing. When he left October 1961, never to return, he said, I do not want to be buried in America. The last thing he said on the boat, he said, 93 years, I've done all I could, struggling against the color line. I've made some progress. the masses of black folks still find themselves living lives of social misery, I cannot imagine at the moment, he said, that American democracy can incorporate black folk. And a touch of irony, he goes to Africa and dies. Marcus Garvey talked about Africa every day. Others without life and never got there. But the deep pessimism of a Du Bois, who dies the night that King gives his I Have a Dream speech. You all recall when Philip Randolph introduced Martin Luther King. I have an announcement to make. W.B. Du Bois died last night in Ghana. And I now introduce the moral conscience of our nation, Martin Luther King. Can you imagine what King felt? Du Bois, 95 years old, given all that he had, and yet still feeling pessimistic. And here's King to stand up as radical Democrat and say, how can I speak to this pessimism? It was very much like 1994 in terms of trying to speak to black nationalists. I mean, the debate about Mr. Louis Farrakhan is very much a part of what I'm talking about. The deep sense of pessimism, the sense of distrust, the tilt toward conspiratorial theories, shot through with xenophobic elements. One usually sees among a despair-driven, downtrodden people, never to be excused on moral grounds, because the black freedom struggle must never be tarred with the brush of immorality because of the thousands gone. But the pessimism being so deep, and the options being hardly discernible at all, and so this sense of rage and fury and revenge targeting traditional scapegoats, women, Jews, in this country, Asians. It's a real challenge. No doubt about it. And then, of course, given the gangsterization of the culture, in which everybody has guns and so forth, well, if we don't have a public conversation, could you let me know whether you are actually equipped or not? Make a run for it?
It always blows my mind when I've heard that criticism that students of color always sit together. And for as long as I've been in this country, I've always noticed in cafeterias that white folks always sit together. But they don't seem, the people who make that critique don't seem to see that. So my question to you is, what do you hope for this country? How do you see extending that into relationships with peoples of the third world?
Of peoples of the third world? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that question. Well, first, on a personal note, I live about 2.5 months a year in Ethiopia, where the same kind of struggle for democracy is taking place, but there we're trying to just set up the very conditions for possibility of democracy, constitution, rule of law, and so forth. And I believe that there are certain possibilities in places like Brazil and South Africa, if in fact the conditions of democracy could be institutionalized. It looks very, very open-ended at the moment. Possibility of civil war, possibility of civil strife, the violence increasing, but also the grand possibility of actually initiating a multiracial democracy. I think that one must create very close and intimate links with a variety of different experiments around the world. One does it on a number of different levels. You do it on an intellectual level in terms of participating in the debates going on there, or actually writing a constitution, as many of us are trying to do right now in Ethiopia. Or the way Roberto Unger, of course, President Harvard Law, runs for office in Brazil and tries, in fact, to be an interlocutor within the expansion of public life and public conversation in a very crucial country, such a large population, and struggling with issues of race and white supremacy like Brazil. So it depends on which particular country one has in mind. For me, it's a matter of focusing on Ethiopia and South Africa and Brazil, but there's a number of other places in Asia. South Korea, for example, I think, is a crucial country in terms of the need to talk seriously about democratization and its impact on other third world countries, given the fact that it's been viewed as the model country, the way so many Asian brothers and sisters in this country have been viewed as the model minority, whatever that means. Many of us have been viewed as model Negroes, so we have some sense of what motivates this sense of being model, being incorporated, being absorbed, being deferential, and so forth and so on. I think it's a very dangerous notion in so many ways. But most importantly, it depends on which country, and it depends on the nature of the connections, intellectual, political, economic, and so on. Got a number of persons in the economic sphere who have quite close relations with Ethiopia, and South Africa, and Brazil, and that economic connection has to do primarily with strategies of investment, back to the question that was asked before, community development, so, both in this country and in other countries. I think in the long run, we're going to have to talk about, of course, transnational institutions. The UN is just one example, but Greenpeace, for example, as a very important progressive institution that's transnational, serves as a fascinating model. Why must we talk transnational? You all know the answer. Because the most powerful elites on the globe have been involved in transnational activity for a long time. And the globe gets smaller, and one can't talk about democratic accountability of powerful elites without talking about transnational institutions from below that provide some means by which those elites are accountable. Part of the debate about NAFTA was not simply for or against NAFTA. Of course, the regional unit's already been basically shaped by the fundamental tendencies of global capitalism. The question of what are the conditions under which that regional unit is going to take place. If there's pressure from below, then we're going to have some strong labor laws and strong environmental laws. And if there's no pressure from below, with or without NAFTA, it's still going to be significant imposition from above. And so in that regard, it's a much more long and epical struggle that we're talking about here.
Within social theory, indigenization of various cultures, this debate has been going on for the past decade. How do you see this within African American culture coming up and being used as a model for a different kind of culture, development of a new culture?
Well, I think I appreciate the question. One, when we talk about African Americans as an example, one has to realize that it's been a much longer process and experience than in so many other cases. And what I mean by that is this, that I'm 13th generation American. Now, I don't know how many people in this room can say they're 13th generation. I'm sure there's some. But most Americans haven't been around that long. Not at all. And we always hear to talk America as a nation of immigrants. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. When we think of immigration, we tend to think of the concentration of persons who came after 1881, though it had been coming early on. But the idea of there being that kind of continuity of 12th and 13th generation, meaning then that from the very beginning, black folk integral to the cultural development, economic development, political development. And when you talk about other so-called third world nations, you're talking about usually a relation of colonizer and colonizer. And you look at the ways in which they indigenize what in fact has been given to them under conditions of domination, in which the dominant culture has been much fewer in number, whereas black folk have themselves been fewer in number against the dominant majority, that you begin to see some of the deep dissimilarities. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about, that it's just simply impossible for the most reactionary white American to conceive of American culture without black people. Impossible.
country music folks say. And of course, country music are not inherently reactionary. Haven't been on the cutting edge of progressive politics either, but they would be the first to say that what they're doing is continuous with so-called country music of black folk, the blues. Deeply American affair. Now, when you look at Europe, at Britain, for example, you try to convince progressive British people that a fundamental element of their identity is black. They figure, what's wrong, you on crack or what? See, America is exception, because it's true. Now, when you look at Britain vis-a-vis its colonies, which is so-called third world, Ghana, Nigeria, and so forth. You say, okay, how then do Nigerians begin to engage in forms of indigenization where they accent the richness of their own history and heritage, but at the same time recognize that they've been socialized under British imperial or post-colonial conditions, and hence create something distinctively new, postmodern Nigerian culture, let's say. Well, what can they learn from America? What they can learn is the way in which hybridity is inescapable, but can they model it after America? Not really. I mean, after Americans? Not really, I don't think. Not at all. I think that there is a certain uniqueness about the African American situation, not because African Americans are better or worse, but because the historical experience has been so unique. There are things to learn from it, but here you actually have a case in which, from the very beginning of the European settler society, there has been this crucial black presence, black element, black contribution. And I think when you look at so many other colonial situations, I mean, India up until 47, or Pakistan up until 47 or 48, it was a very, very different situation, very different. One other last point, and that is that when you get, for example, the clash of civilizations, as we see in Ethiopia, most of you know Ethiopia was never colonized by Europe. Brief presence of the Italians, about 35 to 41, but never colonized by Europe. So Ethiopia stands alone among Africans on the continent of never ever being subjugated in any serious way by European maritime empires. But what you get on the continent is a fundamental clash of civilizations. So the civilization of the Igbos clashes with the civilization of the British. And when you have a civilization to fall back on, you have a deep sense of what I would say they call roots. Whereas the people of African descent, the first proud, skilled African man and woman got off slave ship, by the fourth generation, it was difficult to claim that one had any intimate connection with a distinct civilization. No longer spoke the language. No longer had access to the full-fledged ritual. You had Africanisms, yes. You had deep African retentions, yes. You had African influence, yes. But more and more, especially given the intense interaction of people of African descent with the white majority, the fact that the way in which the plantations and the farms during the slave period shaped the small numbers of black people were there. So unlike the Maroons in Jamaica, you couldn't preserve your own African heritages. All you had was Africanisms. You didn't have a distinct and independent civilization to fall back on. So you became, on one hand, an African, but in an American civilization. James Baldwin called a bastard. Caught betwixt and between. You go back to Africa and they look at you and say, quite American, huh? So no, not really, I'm African. Really? Say a word in African language. A sentence, a paragraph. Well, I don't go that far. I've actually been listening to Nat King Cole lately. Nat King Cole, is he African? Yes and no. Right back to betwixt and between. Are you part of American civilization? Yes and no. I haven't been treated like an American for the most part, but I'm really African American. What is that? African American. What is that? African American. Quite distinct. Quite distinct. So I think it's important to highlight some of the dissimilarities between the situation of African Americans in the development of this civilization vis-a-vis peoples in other parts of the world, in Asia and Africa. I'm sorry to go so long on these questions, but you all asked very good ones, so I'll try to do a little justice. Yes.
Actually, I just wanted to say that we'll have time for one more question, and I'd like to invite everybody to Tilton Hall for the BSC-sponsored reception.
Good evening, Professor West.
Yes, how you doing?
As a proponent of political correctness and multiculturalism is a politically correct idea, could you possibly illuminate this term and perhaps define it for me? And what do you see as the role of multiculturalism on campuses today?
No, I appreciate that. I'm not sure that I would be cast as a full-fledged proponent of political correctness.
You did argue on Bill Buckley's program for political correctness.
Well, they had me on that side. But they had framed the question. You see what I mean? They had already framed the question. Whereas in my comments, I tried to show that it was a much more subtle affair than that kind of either-or approach that's good for one's sales and status in the television industry. Because as I said before, I think that political correctness has problems when it's dogmatic and orthodox. It has problems when it doesn't allow conversation to flow. That it has great insights when it has to do with acknowledging the way in which universities are very different now, and the way in which we have to rebuild communities in light of our diversity and heterogeneity. And if political correctness is used in such a way that one is simply imposing certain views, then that's problematic. If it's used as a way of keeping contact with the degree to which we're in a new situation, sensitivity and decency ought to be part and parcel of what it means to be part of a university community, then it has great insights. So it's a much more dialectical reading of this phenomenon called PC. And I think that's very important because if one views PC as some monolithic X, then it simply becomes a weapon to hit people with. And that doesn't generate any kind of dialogue. It just polarizes. And I refuse to do that. Now, multiculturalism is something else. I'm actually quite suspicious of the term multiculturalism, precisely because, as you can imagine, I don't believe that cultures are in any way to be viewed as something that are set alongside each other like ethnic food at a smorgasbord. And multiculturalism tends to say these are multicultural. No, it's hierarchy. There's cross-fertilization. There's creative appropriation of culture across the board. This is what I mean by hybridity. I think that multicultural also hides and conceals the impact of the issues of white supremacy and male supremacy. What I mean by that is this, that there's tremendous amount of multiculturalism among white Americans. But there's an ideology of whiteness that homogenizes it. So when we think of multiculturalism, we don't think of Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York. We don't think of his mother who dreamed in Italian. We think of me. Why? Well, because multiculturalism among white persons is not really a hot issue. It's tremendous. And not only that, but there's hierarchies among it. Can you imagine what it was like to be an Irishman or an Irish woman, to show up in Boston and to be told that you have more in common with a Brit than you do with somebody else? Given 500 years of British colonialism and imperialism, given the deep sense of antagonism and hostility and animosity between the Irish and the British, what powerful ideology could convince Irish persons that they had fundamental solidarity with Brits? It's called whiteness. Because when they arrived in Boston, they were told they were white. That's what you're talking about. I'm Irish and proud of it. In fact, you are the same as the Brits. He said, you better not say that again. And they said, oh, wait a minute. See those black folk over there? That's who you're defining yourself over against. When you use black folk as the benchmark, then you and the Brits actually do have a racial solidarity. Can you imagine the power of that ideology to convince those folk who have been at each other's throats for centuries and centuries and centuries? Which is to say, that multiculturalism all of a sudden was subsumed, what? Subordinated, what? And the same is true with Eastern European peoples and so forth and so on. So that for me, I don't want to lose sight of the degree to which multiculturalism is a term that primarily alludes to race and white supremacy. Various peoples of color. More and more has to do with the vicious legacy of male supremacy. Issues of gender. Empire ought to be a major category, but it isn't. I think that's sad. I think empire is very important. And so you can imagine when I hear the word proponent of multiculturalism, not really. I want to make sure that we have some illuminating categories, not obfuscating categories. For me, multiculturalism is not an analytical category at all. It's a category to be analyzed. And my hunch, it was probably concocted by some bureaucrat who's trying to mediate some conflict over resources and so on. Not that bureaucrats don't have analytical capacity, but they don't have enough time to develop discourses that reflect that. And so I tend actually not to use the term that much, though I'm quite explicit about acknowledging that when we talk about diversity, we're talking about hierarchy, difference related to degraded other, and the entree of those persons who have been viewed as degraded other, be it Catholics in the 1920s, or Jews in the 40s, or blacks or women in the 60s and 70s. I've forgotten what your question is, but I was trying to analyze in terms of the way the question was framed. I mean, I think we must proceed in such a way that we recognize that fundamentally the end and aim of a university is to involve itself in or to promote high-quality scholarly inquiry and broad intellectual conversation, and such inquiry and conversation must deal with the new understandings of the past in relation to the present and the pressing problems of the present. And therefore, for me, multiculturalism oftentimes is viewed as something that's attached on to the fundamental aim and end of an institution like Clark or Princeton or what have you. Whereas, of course, what these institutions are supposed to be about is serious kind of intellectual work. And if we've seen various white supremacist lies told about the past, you don't have to go multicultural on that. It's just a question of truth and knowledge. It's just what is the case. I was talking to a chap in New Mexico the other day, and he was saying, I've been teaching American history for 32 years, and I've never even mentioned black folks. He says, now I guess multiculturalism tells me that I should add a week. I tell him, I said, black history is not something you add. There is no American history without acknowledging the role of black folk. They're 21% of the population. They're building on the building most of the building. If their labor is producing much of the wealth, if the cotton they picked is sent to the Lancashire mills that become the first industry revolutionized that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, the textile industry. You all know that history here in Massachusetts before North Carolina got it, after North Carolina got it, or before North Carolina got it, I'm sorry. Then we're not talking about something added on. It is integral to it. That doesn't mean military elites are unimportant. Doesn't mean political elites are unimportant. Ask George Washington how important black folk were. He couldn't eat without his slaves. He couldn't get about without his slaves. Ask Thomas Jefferson how important black folk were. He couldn't run his operations without all those slaves. which is not to say that other groups are not important. It is simply to say you can't understand American history without having a synthetic analysis that talks about the links and connections, you see. So that the history that he was talking about was an interesting interpretation, I'm sure. He struck me as a relatively intelligent man, but it was deeply blinded. And that's important in terms of, again, seeing the way in which multiculturalism is not something that is just additive at all. You can't understand the history of the modern world without understanding race. Imperialism is so inextricably interlinked with race. How do you understand empires without understanding race? How do you understand the modern world without understanding empires? How do you understand the modern world without understanding the role of science and technology, and racist discourse and scientific discourses and so on? It's linked to nationalism, and consolidation of nations, on and on and on. To talk about race means we have to recast how we understand modernity, how we understand New World experience, how we understand American experience, and therefore it's not in any way something that has to do with a certain kind of acknowledgement that now these people are here in these halls. What are we going to do for them? It is not that at all. It is a serious intellectual challenge to understand the role of race, the sufferings and doings of people of color in the makings of what we understand the modern and now postmodern world. That's an intellectual challenge. Very much so. Very, very important. Very, very important one. That's a long answer to your question. And still doesn't hit it head on, but I know it's getting late. Thank you all so very much.
We can get over to the hall.
Okay,
There's something this way.
How you doing?
Smile. Okay, camera, India.
Huh? Is it on?
Shoot first. Wait.
What? What are you doing?
Are you going to go to